Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Pechet. This week's learning is sponsored by Audrey Mondro in memory of Irving Poppy Maskoff, Yechezkel Ben Rachel and Abraham, a man that exemplified complete emunah. He greeted everyone with a smile. We were all very privileged to have him in our lives. May his neshama have an aliyah. Okay, I'll start just with two quick messages. Like I mentioned before, our Circle of Friends campaign is running. Thank you to all those who've so far sponsored and helped support our salaries. We actually expanded our staff in the last year also. So to keep everything running, we really need everyone's support. So thank you to those who've already given. And if you haven't yet, you still have an opportunity to do it. Secondly, there's a Shiur, a course that's starting in Hebrew, if it interests anybody, which is we've done in English already three kind of the beginner's guide to Gemara. So we have a parallel one going in Hebrew. I say parallel, it's not exactly the same thing. Everybody deals with different things when they decide to run a shiur like this. So if you're interested in joining, it's the second in the series with Karen Rosenberg. So that's starting in 2 weeks on Wednesday, December 24th. It'll be 3 Wednesdays in a row, an hour-long shiur, and it's recorded. So you can find it on the Hebrew side of our site, at the very bottom of the home, near the bottom of the home page. There's all the courses. Okay, if you're interested in any of our courses, we have a lot of digital online courses in Hebrew and English. So you can, if you haven't seen them yet, you can look and see. Okay. And the other thing I will mention, it's a very kind of lighter, different daf than recently, so that'll be nice for everybody. And it's very interesting daf. In fact, it happened that the Beyond the Daf content this week is all on today's topic, or almost all. Um, and I'll mention them as we go, what the shiurim will be about. Some are up on the site, some aren't yet up on the site. Okay, so I just want to mention one more thing. One second. I just want to check. It just eludes me right now. Right. The truth is there's actually four. Okay, flashback is also on the Bigadim of the Kohanim. That's the written article. Plus there's three other video shiurim on topics from our daf. So let's get started. It just indicates how interesting the stuff is. So the first thing we want to do is finish up with our topic of the airspace of the Mizbeach, and it kind of has an interesting twist at the end, I would say. Okay, so if you're not, I mean, you might be. I think it's fascinating, sugya, to think about the airspace of the Mizbeach and whether it absorbs it or not. Even if you don't think so, it's kind of fun to have this twist at the end. So what we did yesterday in trying to figure out is the airspace of the Mizbeach sanctified. Let's just remember what that means. What it means is we said already, we've been learning this for the last few days, that the Mizbeach sanctifies items that are disqualified. So even though they're disqualified, if they end up on the Mizbeach, we leave them on the Mizbeach, at least many of them, right? We distinguish between ones that yes, ones that not. But we leave them on the Mizbeach unless they get taken off the Mizbeach. If they get taken off, then we don't put them back on. But if they're already there, we leave them there. So we tried to figure out what if it's just in the airspace. We had one attempt to try to say, oh yeah, of course it's like the Mizbeach, and we tried to prove that, because how do you get something from the ramp up, right, without it being in the airspace? We rejected that. We went to then someone who tried to say the opposite, which is from the Ola to Oaf, you can actually see it's not. Okay, now we're going to go to the third explanation. After it was Rav Acha, Rav Hanan tried to bring the against approach. We now start with the bottom of Pesayin and Bet. Lahach gisa mia tifsho, but you should at least then say the other direction. In other words, you didn't succeed in proving yours. Somebody says this. It's an unnamed source, but it says you can at least the Stama de Gemara says you can at least answer the other way, which is Davir mizbeach kimizbeach dami. I get basically it's saying in a kind of weird language, but I can basically prove the other way. Why? Which is like the way we started with. It is like the altar. It does sanctify. Why? Because if you thought the airspace was not like the altar, let's go back to the chatat of. The chatat of has to be done at the bottom. Now, when you do it at the bottom, what if you do it at the top? We learned already that if you did malika at the top of the altar for the chatat of, which is supposed to go at the bottom, it's fine. Now let's think about it. If it's fine, what does that mean? Well, you're already at the top of the altar, which means you could leave it on the altar, and you can even sprinkle the blood from there. So now, even though you're supposed to sprinkle it at the bottom. So now they say, if you, let's say, had a chatata oaf that was psula, so it was a disqualified chatata oaf. Rashi says, like for example, we know chatat shelo lishma is disqualified. So you did this chatata oaf, you disqualified it because you did it on top, but that wouldn't disqualify it. But you did it on top, l'shem, let's say korban ola, as if it was a korban ola, like we saw those cases in Kinim, where the Kohen thought it was right, it was an ola, and he did it at the top, thinking it was an ola. How do you sprinkle the blood of that korban? Because it's a disqualified korban. Now you do sprinkle the blood because why? Because you're on the altar. Once you're on the altar, you don't have to take it off. Well, let's think about what happens when you sprinkle the blood. Where do you sprinkle the blood? On the wall of the mizbeach. So what do you have to do? Well, the Kohen's holding it and he has to sprinkle. So now what happens? You take the blood, the bird, and while he's holding the bird in his hand, he sprinkles on the wall. Well, let's just think about that bird. That bird is going to be in the airspace, right? It's going to be over, right? And even when you put it over the side, it's still in the airspace of the mizbeach because it's got the sovev and the yesod underneath, right? So basically, it's in the airspace. And now, if we're talking about a disqualified sin offering, what do we learn? If it goes up, it doesn't have to come down. But if it goes off, then you don't put it back on. So now, Havale Yarud, this is as if it went off. If you say the airspace doesn't count to sanctify, then as soon as you go to sprinkle the blood on the side of the altar while you're standing on the top of the altar, but you sprinkle on the side of the altar, the bird itself, right, and the blood is off the grid, right? It's off the mizbeach because it's in the airspace only. So, and not only that, but sharp sulim hechizarik lumi daman. Other sacrifices, which we already learned, if the sacrifice is disqualified, if the blood was left overnight, if all these things happened, well, how are you going to ever throw the blood on the wall of the mizbeach? Because as soon as you go to throw it, right, first of all, you're generally off the mizbeach, right, when you're doing it. And even if you were to do it from the mizbeach, but you're throwing it and it's going through the airspace of the mizbeach while you're throwing it because it's not on the ground. It's not on the floor of the mizbeach. It's not touching the mizbeach. So how could you ever sprinkle the blood of a disqualified korban? To which they answered, Dimagalu. If you have a disqualified korban that's already on the mizbeach and it's disqualified, but since it's on the mizbeach, it doesn't have to go down, and that means you could continue the process and sprinkle the blood. But when you go to sprinkle that blood of either the sin offering of the bird or the sharp sulim, what do? You sprinkle the blood in a way that you're actually having the blood touch the wall of the altar so that it never doesn't come in contact with the wall. It's physically touching the mizbeach. That's how you do it. Okay? And that's how they resolved it. Okay, this is just a way of saying you can't prove anything about the Avir Mizbeach because perhaps this is the way you have to do it, where you're touching the wall at the time that you're doing it. The sprinkling, the pouring, right? The throwing. So the Gemara says, no way can you do that. Let's try to imagine, how do you do that? Okay, I don't know if you tried to visualize it, but hahaza'ani mitsuihi. If you're holding the bird in your hand and pushing it up against the wall of the altar and sprinkling blood from there, that action is not haza'at. You're not fulfilling your obligation of sprinkling the blood of the sin offering. What you're doing is squeezing the blood out. That's what you do with the olat ha'of, the burnt offering of the bird, not this one. You're doing the wrong action. And if you say for zrika, for the throwing of the blood, which normally you take the cup and you throw from the cup, right? You twist your wrist a little, right? And a twist of a wrist, you throw it. This is not throwing. My hand holding, the vessel is up against the wall, that would be called pouring. Because if I want to get it from the wall while I'm touching the wall to be on the wall, I'm going to have to pour it, not throw it. It's the wrong action. Ve'od ki derech haza'ah b'kach, derech zrika b'kach. In other words, number one, they say it's not called haza'ah, it's called mitzui. It's not called zrika, it's called shvicha. And even if you say fine, so you do shvicha, you do mitzui, but that's not derech haza'ah b'kach. The Torah says you have to be mazeh the blood of the chatat. And with the other offerings, you have to be zorek. That's not the derech that you do zrika. It's not the way you do throwing. It's not the way you do sprinkling. This doesn't work. This definitely is not true. So to try to claim that it was still touching the wall of the mizbeach, and that's why it's not considered that it went down, that's nothing. That doesn't prove anything. So now it seems like, right, maybe it really is avir mizbeach k'mizbeach dami. Maybe this proves it, because you can't do it while touching the wall. Here you see it doesn't have to be touching the mizbeach as long as it's in the airspace of the mizbeach. But comes Rav Acha with his big twist. Here we go. Amar Rav Acha. If you're still at the head of the mizbeach, then that would work. But that's not what we're talking about. In other words, obviously, avir mizbeach is k'mizbeach if the person holding the blood whatever it is holding the bird, is at the top of the altar. Why? That is not the question. Ki ka'amar d'talino b'kanyamai. The question of avir mizbeach mizbeach dami, you totally misunderstood the question. If someone's standing on the floor of the mizbeach, their feet are touching the mizbeach, the blood is in their hand, or the bird is in their hand, or whatever it is in their hand. That's of course considered like the mizbeach because it's like it's attached to the floor. Okay? So when we had the question before about the ramp and how do you get it from the ramp up, because as soon as you pick it up, right, it's in the airspace. No, it's not in the airspace. That's not even a question. That source is irrelevant now. We even go back and say that source is irrelevant. All this is irrelevant because we're not talking about when a person's standing with their feet on the ground, holding something, with their feet on the mizbeach. If the item is attached through the person holding it to the altar, of course that's sanctified. It's not as if it went off the mizbeach, which makes perfect sense. The question is, what if I'm standing on the floor down below and I have a reed, a really long reed or pole or something like that. And at the end of that pole is the bowl with the blood and it's hanging over the airspace of the altar. Now we're understanding airspace is hanging in midair, basically. If it's hanging in the airspace above the mizbeach, where without a person standing on the mizbeach, that's the question. And that's what we meant. And we're not talking about what we thought we were talking about. That, of course, is going to be sanctified. There's no question there. And what's the answer? Teku. We don't actually have an answer to that question. Okay, which I don't know how often that happened, that somebody had a big pole, and at the end of the pole was the item hanging over the airspace of the mizbeach. It's kind of a theoretical question, and left with a theoretical answer we don't really know. Okay, new Mishnah. Klei halach. Now we get into, if you remember at the end of that last Mishnah, we said just like the mizbeach sanctifies, also the ramp. Just like the ramp, also the sacred vessels. So the mikdash is full of sacred vessels, which were used for all sorts of things, for the blood, for the incense, for all sorts of things that get put in it. And the kmitza from the mincha offering. Now, what do these sacred vessels do? They sanctify things. Anything that goes in a sanctified vessel becomes, what we talked about before, yesterday we talked about this even, kadosh kedushat haguf. It in of itself is sanctified. It cannot be redeemed. Okay, at that point, it's like an animal that was designated for a korban that can't be redeemed. It also can't be redeemed. The kometz is sanctified. This is it. You can't try to remove the sanctity. Before that, you can move sanctity and, redeem it on a coin, flip onto something else. But once it goes in that sacred vessel, that's it. Not only that, the Mishnah says, but also it can sanctify disqualified items, just like we saw with the mizbeach and the ramp. So if something was disqualified, it can be sanctified in this vessel and basically allowed to be used for, in some way. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what vessels sanctify what kind of things. It's not as simple as we think. It's not like anything that goes into a sanctified vessel will be sanctified, but let's see. Klei halach mikadshim et halach. So they had different utensils. There were ones that we use for liquids, ones that we use for solids. The ones used for liquids sanctify liquids. Midot hayavesh, makachod hayavesh. Here, notice instead of klei halach, they use the word midot. We're going to talk about this later. Midot are measuring things for. Okay, I don't know if you have in your kitchen. Most people have dry measuring cups and liquid measuring cups, right? In the temple, the same. They had ones that were meant for measuring liquids, ones that were meant for measuring solids. Soon Shmuel is going to say that's all they're talking about, by the way, in this line in the Mishnah. And in both, the klei halach or for the lach, the yavesh or for the yavesh are only measuring implements. We'll get to that soon. But and because again, there's two different types of vessels. Ones are used for measuring, because remember you need the isaron of the solet, and then this amount of the oil, and that amount of that, so they need a measuring utensil. So there's also that, and the ones you put the things into, like bowls, mizrak, ka'ara, those are all different kind of bowls they had. So the liquid ones for the liquid, dry ones for the dry, ein klei halach mekadesh hayavesh v'lo yavesh mekadesh halach. So liquids don't sanctify dry ingredients, and the ones used for dry ingredients don't sanctify the liquid ones. This goes back to what we said, it's mekadesh hara'oilo, what's appropriate to go in there. Okay, that's halacha 1. Halacha 2 in this Mishnah. Klei hakodesh shenikvu, if you get a hole in them. Imosim behem me'em melachtan sheyosin behem shlemim, mekachin. If you could still use them for what you went to use them for originally, and you could fill them up completely with whatever was supposed to go in there, then it works. Because sometimes you could have a hole, right? If you have a hole, let's say in a bowl that you're supposed to put the blood in, and there's a little hole, the blood's going to come out, right? Obviously, the blood's going to go through a hole. But if you have a solid mixture in there or a dough, let's say of a mincha, it's not going to start dripping out through that teeny hole. So you could use it, then it would be fine. And then it would still be able to sanctify things. V'im lav, and if not, ema kachin, then it won't work. Third halacha, last one for the Mishnah, kulan ema kachim ela bakodesh. And the sacred vessels, if you have them outside the Azara, they're not going to work to sanctify anything. They only have ability to sanctify if they are in the Azara. Okay, they have to be in a holy place in order for the sanctity to go onto the item that goes in it. So the first thing we're going to hear is Shmuel. Shmuel's going to have two things he says here. The first one is this: Amar Shmuel, lo shanu ela midot, ava mizrekot mekachin. He says this whole idea that liquid only does liquid and solid only does solid, that's only measuring implements. But if it's a bowl or something that you use, let's say, to collect the blood or the comets or any of those things, they can be mekadesh any kind of ingredient. How do we know this? Shenemal from the Parsha of the Nisiim. If you remember, it brings in Parsha Naso all the things that Nisiim brought. And right, the heads of each tribe brought a gift when they did the dedication of the Mikdash, of the Mishkan. And it says there, okay, korbanot, karat kesef echad, shloshim mishkala, mizrak echad kesef. So there was a karat kesef, there was a mizrak. Okay, those are two different kind of bowls. And then it says shnehem, both of them were mili'im solet. They were both filled with solet. Now, usually the mizrak is used for liquids because it's used for the blood. But here you see it could be used for solet. Now, solet is fine flour. Now, it's solet blula b'shem and mixed with oil, but that's a solid. So he says, what do you see here? Solids can be used in liquid measuring cups, and obviously it was sanctified there. That was the whole idea. They put them in the bowls to sanctify them. So Amar Rav Acha midifti leRavina mincha lechayi. What do you mean it's solid? This is liquid. It's a right. It's a dough. A dough is liquid. Okay, you can tell me, right? Is dough liquid solid? Is actually a little confusing. So he says, why are you calling that a solid? That's a liquid. So Shmuel's going to have two answers to this. Amar le lo nitzcha ela liyavesh sheba. You ever make a dough and sometimes you have clumps of flour that get left in it? Right? He says, what I meant is it even sanctifies if there's some dry ingredients that didn't get mixed in, it will sanctify those as well. And I was talking about really dry. The second option is to say, well, it's all relative. So if you compare a dough, which is maybe somewhat liquidy, but it's definitely not liquidy like blood, okay, it's a very different consistency. So relatively speaking, it's more like a dry ingredient. Amar Shmuel. So now Shmuel is going to come and say, here are the rules for when a klei sharet is sanctified. You need a few certain criteria. Some, depending on, we're going to have three versions of this. Some are going to be mentioned in the Mishnah and some are not mentioned in the Mishnah. So let's see. In this first reading, only one is mentioned in the Mishnah, and then he adds two more. They have to be whole. Okay, that we saw in the Mishnah. You can't have a hole in it. They have to be full. Now, what does this mean, full? It doesn't mean full to the top. It means that if you're supposed to put a certain requisite amount, let's say the mincha offering, so there's certain amounts of solet and oil that you're supposed to put in, depending on what kind of mincha offering you're bringing. So it has to be full to the amount of the shiur you're supposed to bring. If not, it's not going to be sanctified. Or until you get, it sounds like, until you get to the, right, when you start putting it in, it's not sanctified until you get to the actual requisite amount. And em kachin elamitohan, only what's inside them. Okay, that's a little strange. What else would it be doing? We'll talk about that in a minute. The amrila, some people say, there's a different version. Em kachin, this is version 2. We're going to have, like I said, 3. Em kachin ela shlimim, umaleim, so far those are the same. Umi bifnim. And from inside, where's inside? Inside the Azara. Okay, one said mitocha meant inside the vessel, and this one means inside the Azara. Now that meant that halacha was mentioned in the Mishnah as well. So according to the second version, the only new one that he's adding is they have to be full. Okay, again, full meaning the requisite amount that you need. My benai, what's the difference between these two languages? Again, these two versions. Ika benai beirut say midot. When it says mitochan, and the other one didn't say that, what it means is anything inside the walls of the vessel. What if there's what do you call it? Like a heap Okay, there's a heap at the top, like a heaping tablespoon, right? You have a heaping cup, and there's stuff at the top that's not inside the walls of the vessel. According to the first version, only mituchan, only what's inside the walls of the vessel, not what's heaping above, overflowing at the top. But according to the second version, where they don't say that, then anything in the vessel, even if it's overflowing, the overflow would also be included. So that's the nafkamina between the first two. B'manitatan and a Braita, they have a different version which actually combines all of these. And instead of three, it's going to say four, and it's going to say both of them that are mentioned in the previous. And this is in a Braita, which predates Shmuel. So all four of them. Now comes Rabbi Asi, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, is going to limit what Shmuel said. Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Lo shanu ela. Now we're talking specifically about the requisite amount. When we say you need a requisite amount, and until there's that requisite amount, it's not going to sanctify, we didn't exactly mean it like it sounded. Lo shanu ela she'ein da'ato lahosif. What it means is now here we get back into what we spoke about a lot in the beginning of the Masechet, how important my intentions are. If I intend to put a mincha mix, solet, fine flour, water, I intend to put it in this bowl, but I intend to put less than the requisite amount, then it's not going to sanctify it because it only does mileim, right? It only sanctifies them when they're complete. But aval da'atolo sif, if I start putting it in and I'm starting to measure out, and I put in a little bit and I'm going to add a little more, and my plan is to get to the full requisite amount, well then rishon kodesh, then we don't have to wait until it's full for to say it's sanctified. But as soon as I put a little bit in, that little bit becomes sanctified. So let's say I were to stop in the middle and I never got to the full amount. Since I intended originally to put the full amount in, it's going to be sanctified right then. Okay, so that little amount will end up being sanctified. So what we mean, it only is if it's complete, the complete amount is in there. That means only if I intended to put the complete amount in. If I didn't intend to put the complete amount in, then it won't be sanctified until I eventually put enough in that it's the right shiur. But if I intend from the beginning to put the right amount in, it will be sanctified. As soon as I put a little bit in, it's immediately sanctified. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says. And Tanya Namihachi, here's a Braita to prove this. And we're going to see in here where we get this whole thing about mileim that needs the full requisite amount. Mileim, it comes from the pasuk. What did we just read before? That we had the shnehem mileim solet. They're full of solet. So what do you see here? Mileim ela shlemim. What does mileim mean? Complete, meaning the complete amount. Rabbi Yossi, okay, that didn't prove it yet, but now comes Rabbi Yossi, and this Braita and says, and this proves for Rabbi Yochanan said, Matai, when is this true? Bisman she'ein da'ato lo sif. That's only if you didn't have intent to add. Aval da'ato lo sif, rishon kodesh. But if you intended to add, then already it would be immediately sanctified as it goes into the bowl. Ein halach mekadesh yavesh. Now we're going to have another qualification. We have a lot of qualifications today. Amarav v'itema Rav Asi. Ein mekadshin likarev. Okay, now we talked about before, what does this clay kodesh do when it sanctifies? It means that you can now sacrifice. You can put it on the altar. If I, let's say, do a mincha, and I take the komets on the coin, take the komets out, and I just put it on the altar, I'm not allowed to do that. I have to first sanctify it in a sacred vessel. If I don't do that, I'm not allowed to put it on the altar. So when we say that if I put, let's say, a dry in a liquid or a liquid in a dry, which again, we already limited to say it only means in measuring utensils, which also sanctify, which is interesting in of itself. The measuring utensil also sanctifies. But if I put it in that measuring vessel in the wrong one, if I put it in the wrong one, it's not going to sanctify. To allow me, what does it mean it's not going to sanctify? It's not going to sanctify it in order to allow me to put it on the altar. But, okay, so far that's not really a chiddush. Here's the big chiddush. Aval mekadshin li pasel. But it can make it sanctified for the purpose of disqualifying something. Okay, that we didn't talk about yet. What does that mean? Well, if I disqualify kodshim, do you remember, let's say kodshim become tamei. Okay, what happens? We have to burn it. Remember, there's a special way you treat disqualified kodshim. If I haven't put it yet in a sanctified vessel, then I don't have to burn it if it gets tamei. Okay, it's just chulin that becomes tamei. Okay, so it's tamei. But I don't have to burn it. So comes this Rav, or maybe Rav Asi, and says, when we say that if you put it in the sanctified vessel, I put a dry ingredient in a liquid measuring cup, it doesn't sanctify it, meaning it doesn't allow it to be put on the altar. But it does sanctify it. There is sanctity. It was in a sacred vessel. Again, assuming it's in the Azara. I put it in there. It's sanctified in a particular manner, enough to say that if someone were to make it impure right now, I would have to burn it. Okay? It has sanctity to be ruined, basically. Okay, so it's you could kind of call it sanctity for negative purposes rather than sanctity for positive purposes. So now, now some people said he didn't say Rav or Rav Acha, he didn't say it on this on this part of the Mishnah. He said it on a different source entirely. When you want to bring a mincha offering or libations that go with the sacrifice, or a mincha that goes with an animal sacrifice, or bikurim, first fruits, you can't bring them from a meduma. What's meduma usually? A mixture of chulin and truma that got mixed up, and you're not sure what's chulin, what's truma. You can't bring it from there. And ein sarich lomar, and of course you don't even need to say that you can't bring it from orla or kilei kerem. You can't bring it from something that's forbidden. Remember, orla and kilei kerem are forbidden to benefit from. Truma is just forbidden for a non-kohen to eat, but a kohen can eat them. The kilei kerem, mixed the diverse kinds, and orla, the fruits on the tree for the first 3 years, are completely forbidden to benefit from. So if you have a mixture of orla kilei kerem mixed with other things, you obviously can't buy a mincha nesachim from there or bring it from there. Ve'im hevi, or your bikurim fruits, right, from forbidden fruits. Ve'im hevi lo kidesh. And if you brought them, they're not sanctified. Okay, they're completely disregarded. Now, on that statement comes Rav Acha. Amar Ravi Tamer Rav Acha. And let's say you bring them and you put them in a sanctified vessel, they're not going to become sanctified. Now, the bikurim, just to note as an aside, the statement of Rav Acha or Rav that goes on this doesn't have to do with bikurim, because bikurim never go in a sanctified vessel anyway. You don't put them in a sanctified vessel. But the mincha, let's say you put in a sanctified vessel, it won't become sanctified. Now they say, comes that perhaps Rav's statement was said on this, lo kidesh li karev. It doesn't work to bring it on the altar, but if you took this nisachim, let's say that you took a libation that was made from a mixture of kilei kerem and chulin, and you put it in a sanctified vessel, it would be kidesh li pasel. It would be sanctified to the extent that would disqualify. It could be disqualified, and if something happened to it, you would have to burn it or destroy it. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to a really interesting topic, which is, what about fixing clay kodesh? Okay, you have a clay sharet that got broken. Remember, the Mishna said if it has a hole and you can't use it for its original purpose, you can't use it. So comes the Braita now and says, clay kodesh shenikvu. Let's say you have a hole in a sacred vessel. Ein mitichinotam. You can't meld it back together. Okay, it was a gold vessel. You could really fix that. Not allowed to fix it. Ein mitichin letochan aval. You can't put lead inside to basically fill the hole. And nifgemu, if it got a nick in it, or it got dented, you don't fix it. Sakin shenifgam, you have a knife that you use for shchita, which is also, by the way, sanctified, and it now has a nick in it. Now, you're not allowed to use that because you might cause the animal to be a treifa before you actually slaughter it. You're not allowed to ever slaughter with a knife with a nick. We don't make it smooth out the knife, even though theoretically all these things could be fixed. We don't fix them. Nishmita, if the handle came out, the blade came detached from the handle, and machzirinot, we don't put it back. Okay, why not? The Mishna doesn't tell us, the Braita doesn't tell us why, but we're going to see the words later in the Gemara. There's a concept, very interesting concept. It's the topic of Din and Daf this week, and also Meirav Tubalkan on the Hebrew side, about this concept of ein aniyut bimkom ashirut. There's no poverty in a place of affluence. This means the Mikdash, the temple, is a place of affluence. It's a place of gold, silver, glory, beauty. Everything is perfect. Everything is just so. There's no place for poverty. What is poverty here? Well, fixing vessels, what happens when you fix a vessel? It's noticeable that it was fixed usually. Okay, you can tell. We don't want that in the temple. None of that. This is a very interesting concept because it comes in complete conflict with another concept, which our sugya doesn't talk about this, but there are sugyas that talk about the conflict between the two, of HaTorah chasa al mamonan shel Yisrael. The Torah is cognizant of the fact that they don't want Jews to pay tons of money for everything, right? And if we throw out every vessel that broke, that's going to cost the people a lot of money. And the Torah doesn't try to make us spend unnecessary money. So there's a conflict always between these things. It's like the same conflict you have when you go to buy a lulav and etrog and you want to get the nicest one. But what, are you supposed to spend all your money on the nicest one, right? There's even sugyas that discusses how much of your money you're supposed to spend on mitzvot. Fascinating sugyot. In the temple, there's a bit of a different, the weight is more on the beauty of the place. And that begs the question, and again, not for our daf shiur today, you can listen to Din and Daf this week, but this idea about the Mikdash was a glorious place. It was a place of everything was perfect, and there's some sort of value to it, even though it somewhat conflicts with other values that we have. So there's a balance to be struck here. And here we see it very strongly that we don't fix vessels that broke. And we're going to see all sorts of other halachot relating to this. Abba Shaul Amel, continuing in this braita, Sakim Matrefet, he testifies that there was a Sakim Matrefet, there was one of these knives with nicks in it that was causing the animals to become trefas. And Nimnu ala Kohanim v'ganzua, and the Kohanim took a vote on it and they buried it basically. They said no one's going to use this. And again, they didn't try to fix it. Tanu Rabbanan, another braita, another issue related. Big day kuna, the Kohen's clothing. Kohanim's clothing. You don't sew them. Okay, you don't like weave pieces of material and then sew the pieces of material together. They're completely woven. Okay, other than obviously if you have to attach the sleeves, you need some stitches. But garment itself is woven. We know maaseh oreg, it says, which means completely woven. Why? It's not nice to see stitches in the middle of your clothing. Okay, we don't want pieces kind of like patched together. We want it all to be one unit, one nice piece of material. Here comes the interesting one. You can't launder the clothes of the Kohen. Lo beneter v'lo b'ahal. These are different cleansing materials. Okay, so you can't clean them. If they get dirty, but that's it. They're done. Their use is over. Wait, it sounds like you can't use cleansing materials, but you could use water. Now, at this point, the Gemara is asking, it doesn't make sense that you could use water because what do they think? They think, what's the problem? Okay, take a sweater. Okay, I'm wearing a nice sweater today. What if, right, when I first got this sweater, I didn't want to wash it the first time because I knew that the first time I wash it, it's not going to look good anymore, right? As soon as you wash it the first time, already it doesn't have that nice look of a new sweater. It doesn't feel the same. So it sounds like you could use water, but water would also ruin it. And any kind of washing it would make it look not perfect like it was the first time. So Amar Abai Hachi Kamar, he says like this. This is what it means. And this is going to be one explanation, then I'm going to have a different way of understanding. Hug'u b'mayim, if it's the kind of thing that got dirty, that you could potentially, just a little dirty, you could clean it out with water. Mechabsin otam b'neter v'ahal, then you can actually launder it with any material you want. It's not a factor of what I said about you don't want it laundered at all. It's a factor of how dirty is it. If it's very dirty, okay, going out on a bed, if it got so dirty that you need cleansing materials and it won't come clean with just water, then you can't even wash it with water. In other words, the netter and ahal are there to tell you if you need cleansing materials that it got that dirty, you have to throw it out. Because that's what a king would do. If a king had clothes that got a little bit dirty, maybe you just rinse it out with some water. And then theoretically in the mikdash, you could even use cleansing materials because it's not really so dirty. But if it gets so dirty that a king would just throw it out, that's what we do in the temple. We treat it like a king would. Okay, interesting to think that even in those days, they would throw things out, right? I wonder if kings actually do that. I would imagine they don't really. Also, we have much better laundering machines these days. But anyway, it's an interesting thought about if, right, a wealthy person would just throw it. If it gets that dirty, right, it's not worth it. I've had some things sometimes that get so dirty. I mean, it happens. Usually you only do it if the items are in bad shape anyway, but it gets so dirty. I'm just going to throw this out. I don't want to deal with it. Then there's a different opinion which says, no, we actually don't wash them at all. Nothing. Nothing gets laundered because that's not a way of affluence. Tanu Rabbanit. Now, since we already started talking about the clothes of the Kohen, we're now going to talk about the clothes of the Kohen Gadol and the Me'il of the Kohen Gadol. So we bring a bright about the Me'il. Me'il kuloshot tchelet haya. Okay, it was all made of this color tchelet. Shneimar vayatzet Me'il haifo kliot tchelet. Okay, because it says the Me'il is made of kliot tchelet. Shulav ketzad. Now, it was made sort of like a tzitzit with four corners. And what would you put down at the bottom of the hem? Maybe tchelet argaman b'tolat shanish zulim, right? These different threads thread together. עושה אותן כמין רימונים שלא בתחופיהן וכמין קונאות של כנסות שבראשי תינוקות. they would make these shapes that look like pomegranates that hadn't opened, the top hadn't opened yet. Or another way to describe the shape was these buttons that would be on the helmets of children or something. Okay, hard to know. We don't really know what they're referring to. ומביא 72 זגין, שבהם 72 ענבלים, ותולה בהם 36 מצד זה ו36 מצד זה. You put bells at the bottom. If you have bells, people would hear them moving and make a lot of noise. We'll talk about the noise soon. So you did 36 of Pamo Rimon, right? That's what it says in the Torah. The bell and the pomegranate. And you do 36 in the front and 36 in the back. Because remember, if it has four corners, right, you have a strip in the front, a strip in the back. Rabbi Dosa, Omi, and Mishum Rabbi Yehuda, Shlashim v'Shishayu, there were 36 altogether. You got confused with this 36 number. 36 altogether. Shmona Esrei mitzad zeh, Shmona Esrei mitzad zeh. You had 18 in the front and 18 in the back. Amar Rav Anani bar Sason, he just comes in and pipes in. K'machloket kan, kach machloket b'marot nigaim. There's the same machloket, not the same people, but the same machloket appears. Is it 36 or 72? Also by how many different leprous marks were there. Ditznam, marot, nigaim, Rabbi Yosef ben Harkin Somel, Shlashim v'Shisha, Kavi ben Mahalalel, Umer Shivim v'Shnayim. Okay, we have another machloka, whether it's 36 or 72. Okay, these numbers got confused in two different situations. Our situation is a little different because you can see how they got confused because it's double. So you could have 36 in your head. The question is 36 half, right? 18 and 18, or is it 36 on each side? In the marot, nigaim, it's really just different between 36 and 72. It's more strange to think how they got confused between those two numbers. Another thing, Rabbi Anani bar Sassonu, I didn't check if he comes up anywhere else, but it definitely his name does not ring a bell. No pun intended. Amar Rabbi Anani bar Sasson, Lama nisbecha parshat korbanot leparshat bigdei kuna. So at the end of Vayikra chapter 7, there's basically summary psukim. We're going to get to them and darshan them in a few days. Summary psukim of the korbanot. Okay, the first 7 chapters of Vayikra, all the details of the korbanot. Then we get to, in chapter 8, they mention this whole section on the Big Day Kuna. Okay, they also come up in Shmuel, but they also come up here. So why do they come up next to Korbanot? Lomar Lecha is going to darshan smichu parshiot, and this is the topic that's going to take us to the end of our chapter and the end of our daf today. Ma Korbanot, it's a very interesting way, I think, to end the chapter. Ma Korbanot mechaplim, af Big Day Kuna mechaplim. Just like Korbanot atone, also Big Day Kahuna atone. Okay, now, this is an interesting topic. Gefet, the topic of Gefet, for Rabbanit Yael Shimoni this week, which hasn't gone up yet. Hopefully by today or tomorrow it'll be up. How did Big Day Kuna have the power to atone, right? Like can atone for a sin I did that I didn't do atonement for, right? It's a very strange concept. So there's a lot of questions she asks and deals with in the Shiur. That's number one. Shuli Mishkin wrote about the Kohen Gadol's clothing and the tchelet specifically. And in Machshava Shniya, Rabbanit Yafi Clymer, who's now back not regularly but semi-regularly, she is going to talk about something that comes up at the end of the daf about the incense. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting topics going on here. So now, ma korbanot b'chaplim af b'gdei kuna, they can atone. Now, we're going to get to this week's parsha right now, which is each beged of the kohanim atones for a different thing. Okay, some of if you remember, the kohanim had 4, the Kohen Gadol wore 8, the 4 of the regular Kohen, and then another 4. So we're going to go through these garments. Ktonet, the tunic, mechaperet al shvichutam, a murder. Shenemal v'yishchetu seiri zim yitbalu et ktonet padam. The brothers of Joseph, right? What do? They put his cloak, which was a ktonet, they dip it in the blood after they slaughtered the animal, and they bring it to their father. Now this is a little bit strange because what's this coming to say? The ktonet atones for murder. Now, no, there was no murder here. It's a little bit interesting, but obviously it was connected with supposed murder, right? They claimed he was dead. They almost tried to murder him. A little bit of a weaker connection there, but somehow connecting the ktonet with blood, with bloodshed. Michnasayim, the pants. Mechaprim al giloy arayot. Shenemar v'asele michnasei ba lechasop basar erva. It says make them michnasayim, pants to cover their erva. So there you see that, it must be somehow associated with erva, with forbidden sexual relations. Mitznefet. That was their head, the turban that they had. Mechaperet al gasei ruach, on arrogance. Minayin amar Rabbi Chanina yavo davar shebegova v'yichaper al gova, something of height, right? You wear at the top of your head. That should atone for something about haughtiness and arrogance. Avnit, this is the belt. Mechaper al hirhor halev. Why? Because hechadite. Okay, thoughts you have in your heart, because it's the belt would go, it was aligned with their elbows. Now, if you put it around your waist, or it's above your waist, really, where your elbows are, that's above your waist, that's right under the heart. So it's the location. Okay, you can see how each one they darshan in a very different way, and they get, right, it's very loose connections. Choshen, Choshen, that he would wear on his breastplate, that mechaper ala dinim, shenemar v'sita choshen mishpat. This is where choshen mishpat from Shulchan Aruch comes from, that pasuk. Choshen is called choshen mishpat, so mishpat, judgment. Ephod, the ephod mechaper alav Azara, shenemar ein ephod u'trafim. Okay, here's a pasuk in Hosea which connects ephod and trafim. So ephod atones for avodah zarah. Me'il, the cloak, mechaper lashon hara. Minayin, the me'il was what we talked about before. Shenemar, Rabbi Chanina, yavo davar shebekol, something that makes noise, v'yechaper al kol hara. Lashon hara was spoken, right? It's a loud noise. It's a bad noise. So the thing that makes noise atones for something that made noise. Vitzitz, that's the head plate that the Kohen wears. Mechaper ala zupanim, about brazenness. Vitzitz ktiv, what's the connection? Vayal metzach Aaron, it should be on Aaron's forehead. Uba zupanim, when it talks about brazenness of a prostitute, it says umetzach isha zonah hayalach. Okay, so the metzach, the forehead of the isha zonah, which is her brazen, it's connected to her brazenness. Forehead, they connect. Okay, that connects. Now we're going to end with the difficulty and resolve the difficulty, and with that we'll finish. Ini, is this really true? And we're going to have an issue with two of them. Because Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Shnei dvarim lo matzinu lehem kapara b'korbanot. There's two things that we don't have kapara for them in the korbanot, and presumably in the korbanot or in the kohanim who are wearing their clothing. Umatzinu lehem kapara mimakom achil. They actually get atoned for in a completely different way. Elohim, these are them. Shvichut amim v'lashon hara. So now we're going to have an issue with these two, because they're going to say they're not atoned by the big day kuna, they're atoned by something else completely. Shvichut amim me'egla rufa. That's what the egla rufa ceremony is for, to atone for murder. Lashon hara miktoret. The ktoret is there to atone. Okay, the incense they would do daily atones for lashon hara. How do we know this? Titani Rav Chananya minayin liktoret shemechaperet, and that's really the topic, as I said, of Shavashniya, about the incense. Shenemar v'yiten taktoret v'yechaper al ha'am. Okay, that's after the Korach story, that they put the ktoret and it atoned for the people. Okay, so what it atoned for the people? How do we know it's lashon hara? Shenemar v'tani dvei Rabbi Yishmael al ma ktoret mechaperet al lashon hara. Why? Yavo davar b'chashai v'yechaper al maaseh chashai. Comes something that's done secretly. Why? Because the Torah is offered inside the Heichal. Nobody looks inside the Heichal. It's covered, right? It's in a room, as opposed to the Azara, which is open. And it should atone for something that was done secretly. This is exactly the opposite of what we said about the Me'il is loud, and it atones for something that's loud. So it's very strange. It seems to completely contradict. So, Kasha Lashon Hara, and besides loud and quiet, it contradicts because it says there's nothing to atone other than the Ktoret, so not the Big Day Kuna. So kasha lashon hara, kasha shvichut amim. So we have an issue with both these two. Well, shvichut amim lo kasha. Had yediya man katle, had lo yediya man katle. Okay, well, when we know the murderer, that's when we have the ktonet. When we don't know the murderer, that's what Egla Rufa ceremony is for. Remember, the whole Egla Rufa ceremony is we have a dead body, we don't know who killed him, we measure between the two cities and we try to figure out, but it's only because we don't know who. When we know who, then the big day kuna. Okay, before we get to the Lashon Hara, the Gemara has a big question on this. What do you mean? Idiyadiyam an katle bar katlehu. You don't need the big day kuna to atone for it. What do? You kill the person. Capital punishment. And the capital punishment is what atones for the person's sin, not the kohenim's clothing. To which they answer, we're talking about b'mezeh v'lo atrube. We're talking about when someone murdered intentionally, and we know who it is, but they weren't warned, and then we can't punish them in the court. Then the big day kuna come and atone. And again, that begs the question, how can that work? And for that, you can listen to Rabbanit Shimoni's Shiur. Last line for today, Lashon hara nami lo kashya, habetzina habefrahesya. It's a very interesting way to end our chapter. First of all, in general, there's an interesting way of kind of taking a step back and looking at this idea of atonement and what it's needed for, and how the big day kuna had this special power, so to speak, to atone. Lashon hara, there's two different ways of doing Lashon hara, as unfortunately we all know, right? There's one way to do it publicly. All you need to do is open the newspaper or the internet and see all the public Lashon hara that goes on. That you need the me'il of the Kohen Gadol, which unfortunately we don't have anymore. But that you need something loud to atone for. But there's a lot of Lashon hara that people do, people speaking all the time behind people's backs. That you need something more in secret. And that's exactly explains the differences between the two. And with that, Hadran alach HaMizbeach Mekadesh. a lot of ideas in this daf, a lot of interesting ways to go off on. That's why like I said, all the content ended up on today's daf for this week. But let's just go a quick review. We tried to answer the question of Yomi Mizbeach Dami, and then we switched the whole what the question really was asking about. Not when someone's feet are on the ground holding the item, only when it's up on a pole. Then, and we didn't have an answer then in the end. Then we said that what about sanctified vessels? How do they sanctify other things? In what situations? Dry, liquid. Then we had Shmuel, who limited that whole dry, liquid, only dry with dry, liquid with liquid in liquid measuring, only for measuring and not for regular other utensils. They could be sanctified both. Then we had another thing he said about the criteria for how it works, whether the 3 or 4 criteria, what difference between the different versions. Then we had the statement of Rav or of Asi about they might not sanctify if it's liquid dry measuring and the wrong thing to allow it to go on the altar, but it does sanctify in order to allow it to be disqualified. Okay, so it has some sort of type of sanctity. Maybe that's comment was said in something else. From there, we got into all these things that you can't fix in the temple. If it's broken, you can't fix it because we don't want fixed items. Everyone can notice them. It doesn't look nice. It's not what we want. It's not the look that we want in the temple. It's very important that everything be glorious and beautiful. And you can imagine that this is, I've talked about this other times, but I should just mention in a brief moment, the idea about when people come to worship God, you want it to be all perfect, right? You want to have this aura in the place. If you start having broken old things, right, it ruins the environment that you're trying to create. So you could see, even though it might go counter to some other values that we have, it's very important in this place where we believe God's presence is and that we're coming to worship God, that everything be perfect. Okay, you could see how there's a difference between that and other kind of areas where maybe we shouldn't put such a focus on affluence and all that, or however we, term it. Okay, that's that. Then from there we got into the big day kuna because we talked about can you launder them? Can you right? How are they sewn? And from there we got into by the way they atone for things. Okay, and then we talked about what they atone for, and then resolved that with some difficulties. And in there we had a description of the me'il of the kohen gadol. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day. And like I said, the content, some of it's up already, some of it will go up hopefully by the end of today, if not by tomorrow.